Fort Caldwell, Virginia, October, 6:47 in the morning. The sun had not yet cleared the tree line east of the base when the first helicopter crossed the perimeter. It moved low and fast, the kind of approach that means something specific to anyone who has spent time in uniform. Not a training flight, not a supply run. The pilot was burning fuel with purpose. Nobody on the ground paid attention to it. That was the first mistake of many made that morning. Inside Armory Base 7, the overhead fluorescents were already humming. They had been humming since before dawn, casting that pale institutional light that makes every surface look like a document of itself. The concrete floor was clean. The ammunition racks were organized. On a small shelf near the east wall, wedged between a technical manual and a box of inspection tags, sat a framed photograph. A woman. Two boys. A man in uniform standing slightly apart from the rest of them, the way men sometimes stand when they are proud of something they do not know how to say out loud. Nobody looked at that photograph either. There are places that absorb what happens inside them, not in any mystical sense. Just the way concrete and steel and years of institutional silence can make a space feel heavier than its dimensions suggest. Armory Base 7 was that kind of place. It had been for a long time. That morning, it was about to become something else entirely. In 1968, a sergeant named Roy Merritt filed a misconduct complaint against his commanding officer at Fort Ord, California. He had spent 3 weeks writing it, drafted it by hand in a spiral notebook he kept under his bunk, reviewed it with a JAG officer who told him his claims were serious, his language was precise, and his documentation was thorough. The JAG officer told him the process would take time, but that the system existed for exactly this kind of situation. Roy Merritt believed him. He had been trained to believe in the system. He had given years of his life to it. The complaint was filed on a Tuesday morning in April. By Friday, it had been transferred to a filing cabinet in a building scheduled for renovation. 6 months later, that building was gutted. The filing cabinet was emptied. The contents, according to a report that did not exist, were processed according to standard procedure. The commanding officer retired 18 months after that. Full honors, a ceremony on a warm California afternoon, a handshake from a general whose name appears in the history books. Roy Merritt came home. He raised a daughter. He taught her how to throw a baseball and how to read a topographical map and how to sit with her back to the wall in any room she entered. He never told her why that last one mattered. She figured it out herself. He never filed another complaint. He never talked about the one he had filed. But some things do not require words to be transmitted. Some things pass from one generation to the next the way a name does. Quietly, completely, without ceremony. This is not Roy Merritt's story, but it could not have happened without him. Her name on the paperwork that had processed her arrival at Fort Caldwell 3 weeks earlier was Lieutenant Nora Calloway. She had transferred in from a logistics unit out of Fort Belvoir. Her file was clean, efficient, and entirely unremarkable. Solid evaluations, no disciplinary actions, no particular commendations. The kind of record that reads like it was designed to disappear into a stack of other records, which is exactly what it was designed to do. She arrived on a Wednesday, checked into the BOQ, unpacked a single duffel bag, and spent the first 3 days learning the base the way a surveyor learns land. Not by asking questions, by walking it, by watching who moved where and when and with what kind of authority, by noting the hesitations, the pauses before certain names were spoken, the quality of silence that settles over a group of people when a specific door opens down the hall. She took no notes. She did not need to. She had been doing this for 9 years. On the morning of October 14th, she woke at 5, made coffee in a machine that had been provided by the previous occupant and never cleaned, drank half of it, standing at the window, and at 6:30 walked to Armory Base 7 to conduct what her schedule listed as a routine equipment inspection. It was routine in the way that a controlled detonation is routine, technically accurate, missing the larger point entirely. She was carrying a clipboard when she arrived. She waited outside the bay for 2 minutes before entering, not because she needed the time, but because she was listening. You can learn a great deal about what is happening inside a room from what you can hear through the door. The rhythm of voices. Whether the laughter is the kind that includes everyone or the kind that does not. She opened the door and stepped inside. Colonel Raymond Caulfield was already there. Here is what the record shows about Raymond Caulfield. He was commissioned in 1985 out of West Point class rank in the top 20%. He served in Panama in 1989 during Operation Just Cause. He was in Saudi Arabia for Desert Storm 1991 and acquitted himself well enough that his after-action evaluations used words like decisive and composed under pressure. He earned his first command in 1996. By the late 90s, the trajectory of his career suggested a man who might reach general officer rank before he was done. Men who served in those years remember what that era felt like. The Cold War had just ended. There was a confidence in American military culture, a sense that the institutions had proven themselves, that the machinery worked, that the people inside it could trust the structure they were part of. It was not an unreasonable feeling. It was just incomplete. Caulfield was 41 years old when an officer under his command filed a complaint against him. The complaint alleged improper conduct during an evaluation process. The details were specific, the language was pointed, and the timing was, Caulfield believed then, and believed now, entirely political. The officer had recently been passed over for a position Caulfield had recommended against him for. The complaint Caulfield felt with a certainty that had hardened over 26 years into something indistinguishable from fact was retaliation. He was right, the investigation cleared him. It took 22 months. He lost a command rotation he had been promised. He lost 2 years of forward momentum in a career where momentum is everything. He sat in an office in Fort Lee for 19 months, doing work that a captain could have managed, watching men he had outperformed move past him on the promotion list. He had done nothing wrong. The system had acknowledged that he had done nothing wrong. And then the system had moved on because systems do not issue apologies. They issue findings and then they move on, and it is left to the individual to carry whatever weight the process left behind. What Raymond Caulfield carried from those 22 months was a lesson, not the right one, but a clean one, the kind that feels like clarity because it removes ambiguity entirely. The lesson was this: complaints are weapons. The system does not protect the innocent. The system protects the powerful. Therefore, be powerful. Be the kind of man that other people think twice about before they lift a pen. He had been applying that lesson at Fort Caldwell for 6 years. By the time Nora Calloway walked through the door of Armory Base 717, people had considered filing complaints against Colonel Raymond Caulfield. 3 had gone as far as drafting language. 2 had spoken to JAJ officers who had listened carefully and then spoken carefully about the complexity of the process and the importance of documentation. 0 had filed, until Elaine Forsyth. But that is getting ahead of the story. Calloway entered the bay at 6:48 and positioned herself near the western rack of equipment to begin her inspection. She set her clipboard on the rack, opened it to the first page of the inventory form, and began working down the list with the unhurried precision of someone who has learned that competence is most effective when it looks effortless. 3 men were already in the bay. Sergeant Derek Fallon was 29 years old and had the energy of someone who has found in the structure of institutional loyalty a substitute for whatever was missing before he enlisted. He stood near the ammunition crates with his arms crossed and watched Calloway the way a man watches something he has already categorized. He was not curious. He had made up his mind about her in the first 5 seconds, which is how he made up his mind about most things. Sergeant Todd Greer was older, 44, with a face that had stopped being young a long time before the rest of him caught up. He knew things. That was the clearest way to describe Todd Greer. He had been in enough rooms and seen enough procedures bend in enough directions that he understood how the system actually worked as opposed to how it described itself. This knowledge had not made him braver. It had made him very careful. And then there was Sergeant Marcus Webb. Webb was 51. He had come up through the ranks the long way, one careful step at a time, earning his stripes in the unglamorous logistics and support work that keeps a military base functioning without ever appearing in anyone's after-action reports. He was not a man of dramatic gestures. He was a man of small, consistent choices. Most of those choices over the past several years had been the wrong ones. Not because he was malicious, because he was tired, and because it is very difficult to be the only person in a room who is not going along with what is happening, and because the math of consequence is rarely fair to the people who try to do the right thing alone. He had been carrying the weight of those choices for 2 years. He was still carrying it when Caulfield walked back into the bay at 6:51, noticed Calloway at the equipment rack, and stopped. What happened in the next 4 minutes had the quality of something that had happened before. Not this specific sequence of events, but the template of it, the geometry of power and contempt in an audience assembled to witness both. Caulfield was a tall man who carried his height with the assumption that space belongs to him when he occupies it. He looked at Calloway for a moment without speaking. Then he spoke. What he said first was quite enough that it did not carry past the immediate vicinity. A comment about her positioning near the rack. Something about standing in the wrong sector, which was either true or not true, and either way was not what it was about. Calloway acknowledged it without stopping. Her work corrected her position by 2 steps and continued down the inspection form. This was the wrong response. Not wrong in any rational sense. Wrong in the specific sense of not being the response Caulfield had expected, which was either visible deference or visible discomfort. She had produced neither. He moved closer. What followed was a sequence that the four walls of Armory Bay 7 had witnessed variations of before. Caulfield's voice did not rise immediately. The escalation did not start loud. It started precise, calibrated. It identified a point of vulnerability and applied pressure to it with the focus of a man who has done this enough times to understand that the goal is not to argue. The goal is to establish in front of witnesses the absolute nature of the hierarchy. The argument is theater. The audience is the point. Fallon took a half step forward, not toward Calloway, just forward, repositioning the way a man repositions when something is about to happen that he intends to enjoy. Greer went still. Webb looked at the floor. And then Caulfield's hand came across Nora Calloway's face with a force that was neither impulsive nor casual. It was deliberate, the kind of action that has been considered and arrived at and executed with the full weight of a man who believes with the settled certainty of long experience that he is completely untouchable. The sound of it hit the concrete walls and came back. Fallon made a sound that was almost a laugh. Greer flinched once and then controlled himself. Webb's jaw tightened, and his eyes moved to a point on the wall approximately 18 inches to the left of anything that was actually happening and stayed there. Calloway straightened. She moved slowly with the deliberate care of someone taking inventory of themselves from the inside out. Her hand came up and touched her cheekbone. The contact point was already warm. In a few minutes it would begin to discolor. She registered this the way you register weather, as information. Her expression did not change. This was the thing Caulfield had not anticipated. He had struck people before. Not frequently, but enough to understand the range of responses available to a person in that position. Fear, anger, the frozen stillness of shock. He knew what to do with all of those. He had built his approach around them. What he did not know what to do with was the absolute absence of any of them. She looked at him with eyes that contained nothing he recognized as reaction. Not defiance, not submission, not fear. Something that felt at its edges uncomfortably like patience. The patience of someone who arrived knowing exactly what would happen and is now watching it happen on schedule. He covered this by talking. He turned to Fallon and Greer and began to explain what had just happened in terms that reframed it as education. She's an academy type, he said. She thinks a degree is a substitute for experience. She thinks the classroom is preparation for the field. His voice had the cadence of a man performing for the people beside him, rather than speaking to the person in front of him, which is a different thing entirely and requires a different kind of audience management. Fallon was an excellent audience. He nodded with the enthusiasm of someone who has found in another man's certainty a place to put his own. Greer nodded too, more slowly. The way a man nods when he has learned that nodding is a form of protection. Webb did not nod. He also did not refuse to nod. He occupied a space of studied neutrality that was its own kind of statement, though not one anyone in the room was prepared to acknowledge yet. Calloway still had her clipboard. She had not dropped it when she was struck. She held it in her left hand with the patient grip of someone who intends to return to what they were doing. Caulfield saw this and redirected. What followed was 15 minutes of sustained pressure that institutional hierarchies make possible when all the checks on that pressure have been systematically removed. He was not disorganized. He constructed. He identified the elements of her identity that he wanted to diminish: her education, her youth, her gender, her perceived reliance on connections rather than merit, and he addressed them in sequence with the thoroughness of a man conducting a brief. He moved through them not because he believed everything he said, but because the act of saying them in front of witnesses who confirmed each statement with their silence or their assent was the mechanism by which the power was demonstrated. He mentioned Panama. He mentioned Desert Storm, not to her, to the room, to the accumulated weight of 23 years of service that he was in that moment deploying as evidence of his right to occupy the territory he occupied. Men who were young in 1991 remember what it meant to have been there. Caulfield understood how to use that gravity. He had been using it for a long time. "Nobody's going to miss one less entitled officer around here," he said at one point. And the room confirmed this by continuing to function exactly as it had been functioning. Calloway listened, not performing attention but simply directing it the way someone listens who is collecting something rather than waiting for their turn to speak. Her weight was evenly distributed. Her breathing was controlled. The bruise on her cheek was beginning to show color, a deepening at the edge that would be dark purple within the hour. At some point, Caulfield noticed that she had not checked her phone. It had not buzzed. It had not lit up. She had not glanced toward her pocket. For a man who had been waiting for the moment when she reached for her connections, this absence was vaguely unsatisfying. He decided to address it. He said something about her father not being there to protect her. This was not based on any specific knowledge. It was the kind of thing that sounds pointed, regardless of whether it lands. That you are not anonymous here. Calloway's expression did not change. Then at 7:09 in the morning, her phone rang. Not buzzed, rang, audible in the concrete space with the clarity of something that has been waiting for exactly the right moment. She let it ring twice. The difference between hesitation and choice is visible to someone paying attention in the quality of stillness that precedes the action. Hesitation vibrates. Choice is still. She reached into her breast pocket, withdrew the phone, and looked at the screen. Caulfield leaned slightly forward, trying to read the name on the display. He caught a fragment before she turned the screen fractionally, enough to see that it was not a personal contact. The format was institutional, government. He made a joke about her lawyer. Fallon laughed. Greer produced a sound adjacent to laughter. Webb was looking at the floor again. She answered the call. Yes, sir. A pause. I understand completely. A shorter pause. Copy that. 3 minutes out, sir. She ended the call, slipped the phone back into her pocket, looked at Caulfield. Caulfield smiled. He said something about lawyers and their limited reach on a military installation. He said something about how whatever outside support she thought she was calling in would arrive to find the situation exactly as he had characterized it, a subordinate officer who had behaved inappropriately and received appropriate correction. He had 23 years of service and a room full of witnesses and the weight of institutional culture behind him. He said this with the confidence of a man who has never seriously considered the possibility that the room itself might be the evidence. Calloway listened to all of it. Then she said, I understand your position completely, Colonel. Her voice was steady. The swelling in her cheek was distorting her words slightly at the edges. She said it with complete accuracy and zero relevance to what was actually occurring. Caulfield heard it as capitulation. He was already turning away. Outside, somewhere across the base, the sound of helicopter rotors had not disappeared. They had reduced to idle. The sound of aircraft that have landed but not shut down, waiting. Nobody in Armory Base 7 was paying attention to the sound. Webb was paying attention to something else. He had been watching Calloway for the past 15 minutes with the peripheral awareness of a man who is pretending to look at the floor while not actually looking at the floor. And what he had been seeing slowly and then all at once was something that had begun to pull at the part of him that still knew the difference between what was happening and what should be happening. She had not shown distress. She had not shown defiance. She had shown something he could only describe turning it over in his mind with the caution of a man who understands that language matters as readiness. The word arrived in him with the quiet certainty of something true. She was ready. For what, he did not yet know. But 30 years of experience in uniform were telling him with increasing urgency that what was about to happen in Armory Base 7 had been scheduled, not by Caulfield. He looked up from the floor. Calloway was looking at her watch. The movement was small and precise and entirely without theater. The movement of someone confirming a time against a known schedule. Not checking, confirming. She looked up and found Webb's eyes across the room. For 1 second, she looked at him directly. Not with reassurance, not with warning, with acknowledgement. The acknowledgement of someone who knows that another person in the room understands that the ground has already shifted, even if they cannot yet feel it moving. Then she looked away. Outside, across the concrete pathways of Fort Caldwell, boots were beginning to move. Not the ordinary movement of a base at morning routine. Something with the synchronized patience of people who have been briefed, who know their positions, who have been waiting for a signal that has just been given. Inside Armory Bay, 7 Colonel Raymond Caulfield was still talking. He was explaining to Fallon and Greer and the concrete walls and the fluorescent lights that this was how real military discipline worked. That 23 years of experience had taught him what the academies could not. That the direct approach applied consistently was the only thing that kept standards from eroding into the kind of soft institutional rot that made armies lose wars. He was not wrong about all of it. That is the complicated thing. Some of what he believed was true. Some of what he had learned in those 23 years was real knowledge earned in real places under real pressure. The lesson he had drawn from it was not. But the lesson felt true, and for a very long time the results had confirmed it. The results were about to stop confirming it. Nora Calloway stood in the middle of Armory Base 7 with her clipboard at her side, the bruise on her face darkening toward the color of a winter sky, and waited with the stillness of someone who was exactly where they intended to be, doing exactly what they intended to do. Her father had filed a complaint in 1968 and watched it disappear. She had spent 9 years making sure the next one would not. Outside, the boots were getting closer. Part 2, The Unraveling. Fort Caldwell, Virginia, 7:14 in the morning. Caulfield had moved away from Calloway and was now addressing Fallon and Greer directly, his back half turned to her in a gesture that was both dismissal and performance. The address was reaching a new phase that transitioned from establishing what was wrong to designing what would happen because of it. He had the manner of a man who has arrived at the satisfying portion of a familiar process. Fallon was nodding before sentences finished. Greer maintained his practiced agreement. Webb had stopped nodding 11 minutes ago and had not started again. The bruise on Calloway's cheek had moved past the initial flush into a darkening that would be photographed, documented, and examined in proceedings that had not yet officially begun, but that were in every meaningful sense already underway. She held her clipboard at her side. Her breathing was even. She was listening to Caulfield with the attention of someone cataloging rather than enduring. He mentioned tailhook. He said it as a reference, the way you invoke something you expect the room to share. The 1991 Tailhook Convention, the investigations that followed, the officers whose careers were damaged. He deployed it as an example of institutional overreach of a culture that had allowed political pressure to compromise the military's ability to maintain discipline through internal means. He said it with the ease of a man who has found the argument useful before. Webb's nodding stopped, not dramatically. His head simply did not complete the movement it had begun. Some part of him that was older and more honest than the part trained to perform agreement caught the rest of him, and for a moment he was simply still in a way that was different from Greer's stillness. Greer was still the way a man is still when he has decided to occupy as little of the situation as possible. Webb was still the way a man is still when he has arrived somewhere he has been before and is deciding this time whether to take the same path he took last time. He looked at Calloway. Her profile was toward him. The bruise on her left cheekbone had reached the stage where it was visible from across the room. She was standing in the same position she had held for the past 20 minutes, weight-even clipboard at her side. She looked to someone watching carefully, like a person waiting for something that was already in motion. Webb moved, not dramatically. A lateral step of roughly 18 inches that had no obvious purpose in terms of where he ended up, but covered a distance that in that room on that morning was significant. He was closer to Calloway. He was not standing with Fallon and Greer. The physical gap between those two things was not large. In every other terms, it was the most consequential distance in the room. He leaned slightly toward her. "Lieutenant," his voice was quiet enough that Caulfield, facing away, did not register it. "Walk out that door right now. This is not worth it." It was the most honest thing Marcus Webb had said in 2 years. He knew it when he said it, not because it was eloquent, but because it was true, and he was directing it at a person rather than performing it for a room. Calloway turned her head and looked at him. The look she gave him was not warm. It was not cold either. It was specific. The look of someone identifying a known variable in a calculation that has been running for some time. "Sergeant Webb," her voice was as quiet as his, controlled, unhurried. "I know about your March statement to the IG office, the one you filed under restricted access because you were concerned about retaliation." One beat of silence. "You didn't make a mistake." Webb did not move, not a single muscle. The knowledge that someone else had been carrying knowledge of his statement, that it had been received and acted upon and had become part of something larger than the carefully isolated act he had believed it to be, moved through him in the way information moves through a person when it changes the shape of the past. He had filed that statement in March because the weight of not filing it had finally exceeded his capacity to carry it. He had heard nothing back. For 7 months he had heard nothing and had continued to stand in rooms and look at floors and manage his appearances, while what he had filed sat somewhere in a process he could neither see nor verify. She had seen it. Someone had seen it. "You didn't make a mistake," she said again, quieter. Then she turned back toward Caulfield. Webb stepped back to his original position. He did not return to nodding. Something had left his posture that had been there all morning, not rebellion, not declaration, simply the absence of a performance he had been maintaining and had just decided to stop. Greer had been watching this exchange from his position near the ammunition crates, catching enough of it to understand that something was happening that he did not have complete information about. He dealt with incomplete information the way he dealt with most threats, by reducing his exposure and increasing his watchfulness until the picture clarified. He took a half step backward, not enough to be noticed, just enough. At 7:23, Fallon decided to search Calloway's pockets. The justification he offered was thin enough to be transparent, But Caulfield accepted it with the nod of a man who understands that the acceptance of thin justifications is itself a demonstration of power, because it says clearly that justification is not actually required. Fallon moved toward Calloway with the energy of someone who has been waiting for an assignment. She did not resist. She stood and allowed him to search her outer pockets. Her weight even, and her expression unchanged, as though the enterprise was occurring in a space slightly adjacent to herself. Her outer pockets contained her inspection in form of pen and a folded copy of the bay's maintenance schedule. Fallon held each item up with the diminishing satisfaction of someone whose certainty is encountering material resistance. Then he found the inner pocket, along the lining of the jacket, not part of standard issue, requiring modification. He worked his fingers along the seam, found the edge of something stiff and rectangular, and pulled it out. A card, approximately credit card sized, official in appearance. Fallon read the front of it, and his expression moved through several things in rapid succession. Confusion first, then the particular blankness of a man who has encountered a designation he does not recognize but senses is significant. His lips moved slightly as he read it again. He turned it over. Read the back. He said nothing. He held the card slightly to his side in the gesture of a man who wants someone else to tell him what he is holding. Greer saw it from where he was standing. He had good eyes, and he had been watching carefully, and the designation on that card was one he recognized because he had spent enough years adjacent to the edges of the system to know what it meant when the system turned its attention on itself. Pentagon Inspector General Access Card, Level 4. Something went out of Todd Greer's face, not color, something more interior. Some background confidence that had been operating without his attention simply stopped. He became very quiet in the way that a system becomes quiet when it has been switched off rather than run down. He looked at the card in Fallon's hand, and then he looked at the woman standing in the center of the room with a bruised face and a clipboard, and an expression that had not changed once in 35 minutes. And he understood with the sudden terrible clarity of a man who has been in enough rooms to recognize a trap that he was inside one. Caulfield had not seen this exchange. He was still facing away, building toward whatever conclusion his current argument was aimed at. Fallon was still holding the card with the expression of a man waiting to be told whether he is holding something dangerous. Calloway said nothing. She watched Fallon hold the card the way you watch someone pick up something whose weight they do not yet understand. Fallon put it in his pocket. This was also a choice, also irreversible. Like most irreversible choices, it did not announce itself as such in the moment it was made. The morning had been running for 40 minutes when Caulfield reached the transition from correction to consequence. He proposed that she would clean the armory, start with the ammunition racks and work down to the floor. Supervised, extended, visible enough to serve as demonstration that correction had occurred and been accepted. He said it with the satisfaction of a man who has found an elegant solution to a problem he has defined entirely on his own terms. Fallon received this proposal with audible enthusiasm and offered additions. The main courtyard during the lunch hour, a written acknowledgement, a formal presentation to base personnel. Each addition was received with approval and built upon. Greer was silent. Calloway listened to the plan being constructed with the patience of someone who has heard similar plans before and knows they will not survive contact with what is coming. Then she said, Colonel Caulfield. The quality of her voice had changed, not in volume, not in the controlled evenness that had defined it throughout the morning. Something else had shifted. A specificity that had not been there before. The register of a person who has decided that a particular moment has arrived and is moving into it. Caulfield stopped. Fort Bragg, she said. October 2022. Staff Sergeant Elaine Forsyth. Case number 2022-YG-4471. The room went quiet in the way a room goes quiet when the words spoken in it have changed the nature of what the room is. You remember that one? It was not a question. No upturn at the end. No interrogative register. A statement delivered with the flat certainty of someone who already knows the answer and is giving the other person the opportunity to decide how they want to enter the record. Caulfield's face did something complicated. He was a man who had been in difficult conversations before. He had sat across from investigators and legal officers and review boards and had understood in each setting that the key was to calibrate your response, to produce the register of appropriate concern without producing anything that functions as admission. What his face produced in the 2 seconds after Calloway said those words was something he could not quite calibrate. She should not know that name. She should not know that case number. Those records were restricted. That investigation had been closed under protocols he had been assured by people whose job it was to assure him of such things were sufficient. He had been told a lot of things by people whose job it was to tell him things. Webb stepped back when she said Forsyth's name, not away from the situation, Back to the wall, the deliberate movement of a man who is clearing the frame before something happens, who understands that where you are standing when things unfold matters in ways that are both physical and institutional. Greer's hands came to his sides with the careful visibility of a man managing every signal his body produces. Fallon was looking at Caulfield, waiting for the response that would tell him how to feel about what he had just heard. Caulfield said something about restricted records and access protocols, and the serious professional consequences for misuse of classified case information. He said it with authority. The authority was real. What had gone out of it was the certainty underneath it, and anyone paying attention could feel the difference between authority that rests on solid ground and authority that is working very hard to produce the sound of solidity. Calloway did not respond. She looked at him with the patience of a woman who has a schedule and knows she is on it. There is something worth understanding about the years between 2001 and 2024, those years in particular, for anyone who served in them or lived adjacent to people who did. The military spent a long time in that period being asked to account for itself. Not always fairly, not always with adequate understanding of what was being asked or why. But the question was asked in congressional hearings, in inspector general reports, in independent reviews, with increasing frequency and increasing consequence. Abu Ghraib in 2004, the Fort Hood Independent Review in 2021. The accumulated weight of cases in which internal mechanisms for addressing misconduct had failed so completely and so visibly that external mechanisms had been forced to intervene. Men who served in those years understood what that pressure meant. They had watched the distance between a complaint filed and a consequence delivered shrink in some cases and remain vast in others. They understood that the system was not one system. It was 1,000 individual rooms, each with its own gravity, and what happened in each room depended enormously on who was in it and what everyone present had agreed through silence or assent to allow. What it requires in each room where that agreement has gone wrong is someone willing to enter it with full knowledge of what it is. Caulfield had moved to the window. He stood at the high, narrow glass, looking out at the concrete pathways of Fort Caldwell with the expression of a man producing composure, which is a different thing from the composure itself and visible as such to anyone who knows what the real thing looks like. Outside, the base went about its morning business with the indifference of institutions to the things occurring within their component rooms. After a moment, not speaking to anyone in particular, looking at the window rather than through it, Caulfield said, 23 years, I built this place. He said it the way a man says something he has not said before and is saying now because the weight of it has finally exceeded his ability to keep it internal. Not a justification, not an argument. A man in his 50s looking at the sum of decades and encountering, perhaps for the first time in the specific way, understanding sometimes arrives only when it is too late to change the arithmetic that the thing he had built and the way he had built it were not separate questions. Nobody responded. The room held the words the way it had been holding everything. Calloway was looking at her watch. 7:41 in the morning. Webb stepped out of his position. Without announcement, without looking at Fallon or Greer. He moved a lateral 2 feet away from the wall and stood in a space that was neither here nor there in physical terms, but was in the terms that mattered a declaration. He was no longer standing with Fallon and Greer. The distance between those two facts was not large in any measurable sense. In every other sense, it was the most significant geography in the room. Fallon noticed it first. His expression moved through confusion, then offense, then something that cycled toward alarm, because Derek Fallon had built his entire understanding of this morning on the assumption that all four of them were on the same side of it, and he had just watched that assumption stand up and walk across the room. Greer noticed it second. He looked at Webb, then at Calloway, then at his own hands. The fingers of his right hand moved once, a slight adjustment against his palm, the smallest possible acknowledgement of something arriving that he had been expecting and dreading. Then his hand was still again. He had managed his appearances through everything else. He would manage them through this. Caulfield had returned to the room's center and was elaborating on the punishment plans with the creative energy of a man who has found his project engaging. The main courtyard, the lunch hour, the visibility of the lesson to the full personnel complement of Fort Caldwell. He was building something with the focused attention of someone who has not yet registered that the foundation has shifted. The radio traffic outside had been growing for the past 10 minutes, not loud enough to interrupt the conversation inside the bay. Consistent. The frequency of communications that sounds different from routine-based chatter to anyone who has been through enough operations to know the difference between a base going about its business and a base executing a plan. Webb had been through enough operations. He was listening with one part of his attention while the rest managed his position in the room. His 30 years of experience were doing what experience does when it encounters familiar patterns, assembling fragments into something recognizable. Something that had a name and a structure and implied a sequence of events he could now anticipate with reasonable precision. The radio traffic meant personnel were positioned outside this bay, not passing through, positioned. The helicopter that had landed without shutting down meant there was somewhere to take people from here in a hurry if circumstances required. The woman who had said 3 minutes out at 7:09 and had not moved or flinched in the 40 minutes since was not here by accident and had not been here by accident for any of the 3 weeks she had been on this base. He looked at Calloway. She was not looking at him. She was looking at Caulfield. But something in her posture had shifted in a way that was legible to Webb, who had spent the morning watching her with the focused attention of a man whose survival has repeatedly depended on reading exactly this kind of change. She was no longer waiting. She was ready. Caulfield stopped mid-sentence. He had heard something or felt something. The change in ambient pressure that a room undergoes when what is about to happen begins to happen. He looked at Calloway with an expression that had, for the first time all morning, shed its performance and become simply a face. A man's face looking at a situation he had not written and was only now beginning to read correctly. "Who exactly did you call?" His voice was different, still controlled, but the confidence in it had shifted from the settled certainty of a man on familiar ground to the focused urgency of a man doing rapid assessment of terrain that has turned out to be different from what his maps described. Calloway looked at him. She looked at him the way she had looked at him all morning, with the same quality of attention, the same evenness, the same absolute absence of anything that required him to manage or respond to. Then she looked at her watch. One final time. Small, deliberate. Confirmation, not consultation. The movement of someone who already knows what the clock will say and is simply noting that it says it. She did not answer his question. Outside, the boots had stopped moving. The radio traffic had gone silent, in the way that radio traffic goes silent when everyone involved in an operation has reached their position and is waiting for the next signal. The helicopter rotors maintain their idle with the patient consistency of machinery prepared for a specific use and willing to wait as long as the use requires. Fallon looked at the door, then at Caulfield, then at the door again. Greer stood with his hands visible at his sides in the careful posture of a man who has decided how he wants to appear when the next 30 seconds arrive. Webb stood where he had moved to. He had chosen his ground. He was not moving. Caulfield took a breath. He opened his mouth to speak again, to fill the silence with the thing that had always worked the voice, the authority, the 23 years pressed into the service of a single present moment. The electronic lock on the armory door disengaged with a sound that cut through everything. Not loud, precise. The sound of a security system responding to a credential that outranked the last credential to program it. A sound that to anyone who understood what it meant was less like a door opening and more like a verdict being delivered. The heavy steel door began to move. The October light from outside came in first, the kind of light in Virginia that is specific and clean and carries the quality of cold clarity before the figures in the doorway resolved into their full dimensions. Caulfield stood in the center of the room he had commanded for 6 years and did not speak. The light was filling with the shapes of people who had not been invited. Nora Calloway did not turn around to look at the door. She already knew what was there. Part 3, The Weight of Eagles. 3 figures stepped through the doorway. They moved the way senior military officers move when they are executing something, rather than inspecting something, with the economy of people who have been briefed, who know exactly where they are going and why, and who have long since passed the stage of their careers where any room requires them to announce themselves. The October light came in around them, and then the door closed and the light went with it, and what remained was the fluorescent hum and the concrete and the 7 people whose morning was about to be sorted into categories that could not be uncategorized. Brigadier General Patricia Holt was in front. She was 58 years old and had a face that does not reveal what it is thinking, because it has spent decades deciding that what it is thinking is not the relevant information. What was relevant was what she was doing, and what she was doing was crossing the floor of Armory Base 7 with measured steps, her gaze moving across the assembled personnel with the professional completeness of someone taking inventory of a scene she has already been extensively briefed on. She wore her rank the way certain people wear it, not as decoration, but as accumulated fact, the visible record of a long chain of decisions each made correctly enough to produce the next one. Behind her, 2 full colonels carried the posture of men who are present in a supporting capacity and understand that the supporting capacity is in this moment the correct role. They held folders, official folders, the kind with institutional seals on the cover that function less as documents and more as architecture, the visible structure of what is about to happen. Caulfield said, "Sir," and then said nothing else. The word came out with the reflexive quality of a conditioned response. His body still knew how to address superior authority even while the rest of him was working through the implications of that authority's arrival. Here now in this specific room on this specific morning. He straightened, his shoulders went back. The performance of military bearing arrived automatically the last functioning system in a man whose other systems had just encountered information they were not equipped to process. General Holt did not look at him. She looked at the woman standing in the center of the room with a bruised face and a clipboard, and the quality of stillness that had defined her since 6:48 that morning. She looked at her the way you look at someone when the looking is itself a form of official acknowledgement, when the recognition is not personal, but institutional, which makes it in some ways more significant than the personal kind. "Lieutenant Calloway." Her voice was precise and without warmth, which was not the same as being cold. The voice of a woman who has learned that warmth and precision are both tools and that the appropriate one depends entirely on what the situation requires. "Are you injured? Do you require immediate medical attention before we proceed?" Phrased as a protocol being executed, not a question. Calloway came to attention. The movement was clean and immediate, and it revealed something that the morning had been concealing. The way she moved into that posture was not the movement of a lieutenant responding to a general. It was the movement of someone returning to a posture they were accustomed to, the way a person who has been holding their body in a constrained position moves when the constraint is finally removed. The spine straightened to a height that changed the geometry of the room. The shoulders settled into a position that was comfortable rather than performed. "Sir, I am functional and prepared to continue with mission parameters as originally outlined." A single beat of silence. "The documentation on my face is adequate for evidentiary purposes." Fallon's mouth opened slightly. Evidentiary purposes. The phrase landed with the weight of language that belongs to a world of proceedings and records and formal consequence. It was not the language of a subordinate officer managing a difficult situation. It was the language of someone describing a crime scene from the inside. Someone who had been incited on purpose. General Holt nodded once, then she turned. Not toward Caulfield, toward the wall where Marcus Webb was standing. "Sergeant Marcus Webb." Webb straightened. "Cooperating witness, Operation Iron Standard. Confirmed present." The room did something that rooms do not often do. It reconfigured, not physically. The concrete and the shelving and the fluorescent lights remained exactly as they had been. But the relationships between the people inside it shifted in a way that was visible the way tectonic effects are visible before the cause is fully understood. The floor had not moved, and yet nobody was standing on the same ground they had been standing on 4 seconds earlier. Fallon turned and looked at Webb. The look on his face moved through several things: confusion, recognition, the specific recalibration of a man discovering that someone he had assumed was on his side had been doing something he had not known about for longer than this morning, for longer perhaps than he could yet calculate. What arrived finally on Fallon's face was something that felt like betrayal from the inside, which is the part that matters, regardless of the accuracy of the categorization. Webb stepped forward, away from the wall, away from the position he had occupied for most of the morning. He crossed the floor in 4 steps and came to stand to the left of Calloway at a slight distance, the distance of someone taking a position rather than seeking shelter. He did not look at Fallon. He did not look at Greer. He looked at General Holt with the expression of a man who has been waiting for a moment he was not entirely sure would come and has now discovered that it has. The relief in his face was complicated by everything that had preceded it, by the months of silence and the rooms he had stood in and the floor he had looked at, and the knowledge that the moment arriving correctly does not retroactively correct the journey to it. But the relief was there, real and visible, in his. Greer had not moved. He was standing with his hands visible at his sides. Very still, his expression resolved into something careful and uninformative. The expression of a man managing his appearances on the calculation that how he looks in the next few minutes will affect what happens to him. He was not wrong to make this calculation. He was simply extremely late to it. The colonel, to General Holt's right, stepped forward and opened his folder. He addressed the room with the tone of someone reading into an official record, which is exactly what he was doing. "Colonel Raymond Caulfield, you are hereby formally charged under Article 128 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice with assault. You are further charged under Article 133 with conduct unbecoming an officer. Additional charges include abuse of authority, violation of Article 92, regarding failure to obey lawful regulations, and conspiracy to violate the civil rights of subordinate personnel. These charges have been authorized at the level of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and will be pursued to the full extent of both military and applicable civilian law. Caulfield did not move. He was standing in the center of the room he had commanded for 6 years, and his face was doing what faces do when the architecture of a person's understanding of their own situation collapses all at once rather than in stages. It was not dramatic. Dramatic would have been easier to watch. It was the quiet, specific devastation of a man who has just understood that the thing he believed was protecting him was in fact the thing that had been documenting him. That every demonstration of power had been simultaneously a demonstration of evidence. That the room he had believed was his had been for the past 3 weeks a room with a purpose he had not written. 23 years. He had said that to the window earlier. Like a talisman, as though the accumulated years were proof of a weight and a gravity that should have been sufficient to determine the outcome of any room he entered. He had meant it as a statement of value. It was being received as a statement of duration. The duration of the pattern. 17 complaints over 14 months. The length of time a system can absorb something before the absorption mechanism itself becomes the most important piece of evidence. The second colonel stepped forward. Sergeant Derek Fallon, Sergeant Todd Greer, you are each individually charged with conspiracy to violate civil rights accessory to assault conduct, prejudicial to good order and discipline, and failure to report criminal misconduct by a superior officer. These charges carry potential sentences including confinement, reduction in rank, forfeiture of pay, and dismissal from military service. Fallon sat down. He did not intend to sit down. His legs declined to continue managing his weight, and he sat on the edge of the nearest ammunition crate with the sudden quality of a structure that has lost its load-bearing member. He sat with his hands on his knees and looked at the floor, and the man who had spent the morning performing enthusiasm for another man's power was no longer performing anything at all. Greer received the charges standing. He received them with the careful stillness he had deployed all morning. But it was a different stillness now, not the managed neutrality of a man choosing his position. The stillness of a man whose calculations are complete and who is waiting with the patience of someone who has prepared for a particular kind of aftermath, for the process to move to its next stage. He would manage his appearances through every stage of what followed. It was the skill he had invested the most in developing. The military police officers who had come in behind the generals moved to positions along the walls. Legal representatives with briefcases established themselves near the door. The room had been transformed in the space of 7 minutes from Caulfield's domain into something that more accurately reflected what it had been all along. A location, a crime scene, a room where a pattern of behavior had finally run out of space to continue. General Holt looked at Calloway. One word. Lieutenant, the economy of a senior officer communicating authorization through register rather than content. Calloway reached into her breast pocket. She removed a small device, rectangular, unremarkable in appearance. She held it briefly and then extended it toward the second colonel, who received it with the formality of someone accepting evidence that has already been assigned a case number. Audio documentation, Calloway said. 47 minutes of continuous recording. Verbal harassment, explicit threats of systematic humiliation statements regarding abuse of authority, and multiple instances of self-incriminating testimony provided without prompting or coercion. She paused for one beat. The subjects were thorough. Before the military police reached Fallon, one of the legal representatives crossed to him directly with the flat efficiency of someone executing a specific item on a checklist. Sergeant Fallon, the access card you removed from the lieutenant's jacket. Return it now. Fallon looked up. He reached into his pocket with the mechanical compliance of a man who has stopped making his own decisions. He held the card out without speaking. The representative received it with gloved hands, placed it into an evidence envelope, sealed the envelope, and signed across the seal without looking up. The exchange took 11 seconds. It was the most efficient thing that had happened in Armory Base 7 all morning, and it closed a loop that Fallon had not understood he was opening when he put the card in his pocket 40 minutes earlier. Then the representative stepped back and the military police moved forward and the formal procedures began. Caulfield was looking at Calloway. He had been looking at her for the past several minutes with an expression that had settled past the initial collapse into something harder to categorize. He was looking at her the way a man looks at something he has fundamentally misread, not with anger, which had gone somewhere further back, but with the focused and uncomfortable attention of someone trying to reconstruct where the misreading began. At what point he had looked at something and seen only what he expected to see. At what point his certainty about what was in front of him had become the mechanism of his own undoing. He had seen a lieutenant, an academy type, a young woman who thought her credentials entitled her to something she had not earned. He had not seen the thing that was actually standing in front of him. He was seeing it now. Calloway reached up with both hands and unclasped the insignia at her collar. She did it without theater. The way you remove something that has been sitting in the wrong place and is being returned to its correct position. The lieutenant's insignia came away in her left hand, and she held it briefly, and then she placed it on the nearest shelf with the deliberate care of someone who understands that the object being set down is not actually what is being set down. What was visible at her collar when the lieutenant's insignia was gone was not a bare collar. The eagles of a full colonel looked back at the room. They had been there all morning, concealed under a layer of fabric designed for exactly this purpose, under the insignia of a rank she had been wearing as a cover identity for 3 weeks at Fort Caldwell, under the assumption that she was exactly what she appeared to be, which is the central mechanism of every operation that has ever depended on the distance between appearance and reality. Colonel Sarah Merritt, Pentagon Inspector General's Office, Operation Iron Standard, authorized by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, executed over 14 months, culminating in 3 weeks of direct infiltration at this installation. The room held this information the way the room had been holding everything. Fallon was still sitting on the ammunition crate. He looked at the eagles on her collar with the expression of a man reviewing a sequence of events over and over and arriving each time at the same conclusion he cannot make himself accept. The lieutenant who had walked through the door at 6:48, the woman who had stood and absorbed what was done to her in this room without moving, without calling for help, without breaking. She had not been absorbing it. She had been collecting it. Every word, every threat, every escalating plan Caulfield and Fallon and Greer had constructed with such enthusiastic confidence, all of it had been delivered directly into the record she was building. Webb stood at his position with the expression of a man who is experiencing something that does not resolve easily into a single feeling. Not relief exactly, not satisfaction, something more honest than either. The feeling of a person who has finally done the right thing and is discovering that doing the right thing when it arrives 14 months late does not produce clean resolution. It produces something that requires sitting with. He would face administrative proceedings. His cooperation would be considered. The outcome was not yet determined. That was the honest part, the part that made it real rather than merely satisfying. The military police completed the formal arrest procedures with the practiced efficiency of people executing a task they have extensively prepared for. Each individual was addressed by name and rank. Restraints were applied, paperwork was produced and signed in the specific order that the specific protocols required, because the protocols existed for reasons that Elaine Forsyth and the 16 other people who had filed complaints understood better than anyone else in that room. Caulfield was led toward the door. He walked without resistance. His bearing was still military because 23 years of physical training does not dissolve in 20 minutes. But it was military in the way of a structure that has lost its purpose while retaining its shape. He walked across the floor he had commanded for 6 years, and through the door he had opened every morning for 6 years, and the October light outside received him without ceremony and without comment. He did not look back at the room. Some men leaving a room for the last time look back, not from sentiment, but from the need to see the room whole from outside it, to understand what it looked like from the perspective of everyone who was not them. Caulfield did not look back. Perhaps he already knew what it looked like. The room cleared the way rooms clear after significant events, with the movements of people who have tasks and the particular quality of people who have witnessed something that has not yet finished being processed. The legal team worked. The police team worked. General Holt conducted a brief and precise conversation with the base's executive officer about interim command structure. She used few words. The words she used were sufficient. Webb was escorted to a separate room down the corridor by one of the legal representatives. Not under arrest, under process. The distinction matters and was explained to him carefully. He nodded in the way a man nods when he understands what he is being told, but is also understanding something larger. Something about the long tail of choices made in rooms where the easier path is the one that costs other people. Fallon and Greer were transported from the bay in separate vehicles. Greer went with the controlled composure of a man who has decided that composure is the only remaining asset within his control, and he intended to manage it accordingly through every stage of what followed. Fallon went quietly in the quiet of a man who has not yet found the story that makes what happened this morning livable and does not yet know whether such a story exists. Colonel Merritt was standing near the east wall when the door opened again. Staff Sergeant Elaine Forsyth was 41 years old. She had served 16 years before the events of October 2022 at Fort Bragg. She had returned to civilian employment 8 months after filing her complaint not by choice, and not with any formal explanation that satisfied either the letter or the spirit of the process. She was wearing civilian clothes, and she walked into the bay with the quality of someone returning to a place they had left under circumstances that made return feel like something that was not supposed to be possible. She stopped a few feet inside the door and looked at Merritt. The bruise on Merritt's face had settled into its full color. Significant, documented. It would appear in photographs and reports and proceedings as evidence of a system exercising itself against the person sent to document it. It would be cited in training materials. It would become, in the institutional language of what followed, an exhibit. Forsyth looked at it without speaking for a moment. "I didn't think anyone was listening," she said. "Not dramatically. The way a person says something true that they have been carrying for a long time. Not performance. Release." Merritt looked at her. "We were," she said. "It just takes time to build something that won't fall apart in court." This was true, and it was also not the whole truth, because the whole truth included 14 months and 17 complaints and the specific individual costs borne by each person who had decided to trust a process that had failed every person before them. It included Forsyth herself and the whelm and the separation and the months of reconstruction and the specific weight of having told the truth and watched it get treated as a problem. And it included Roy Merritt in 1968 in a filing cabinet in a building scheduled for renovation, and a daughter who had spent 9 years learning the difference between trying and building and how to do the second thing in a way that the system could not misplace. Merritt did not try to condense any of this. She said the part that was true and sufficient for this moment in this room with this woman standing in front of her, and Forsyth received it the way people receive things they have waited a long time to hear. Not with explosion. With the quiet, complete recognition of something finally arriving at its correct destination after a very long journey. They stood together in the bay for a moment. Then the legal team required Forsyth for her formal statement, and she was escorted out, and the room began to empty in earnest. General Holt paused at the door on her way out. She turned and looked at Merritt with the specific quality of a senior officer acknowledging something she respects, without requiring the acknowledgement to be elaborate. "The documentation from this operation will be used to train investigators across all service branches," she said. "What you built here will run for a long time." Merritt came to attention. Holt left. The footsteps faded down the corridor. The sound of official vehicles departing moved through the concrete walls. The helicopter changed pitch as its rotors increased from idle toward departure, and then it was in the air, and then the sound diminished, and then it was gone. The armory was quiet. The fluorescent lights continued their hum, the same hum they had been producing since before dawn, the unremarkable sound of an institution continuing to function, regardless of what has occurred within its walls. The ammunition racks were still organized. The concrete floor was still clean. The framed photograph on the shelf near the east wall was still there. Merritt looked at it for a moment. The woman, the two boys, the man in uniform standing slightly apart from the rest, proud of something he did not know how to say out loud. She crossed to the shelf and set it face down. Not with anger, with the quiet practicality of someone who understands that some objects belong to a version of a morning that no longer exists. She was alone in the room now. She stood in the center of it, in the place she had stood since 6:48, and she let the room be what it was. She reached into the inner pocket of her jacket, not the pocket where the access card had been. The other pocket closer to the center of her chest where things are kept that matter in the way things matter when they have been carried for a long time. She took out a photograph. Small, old, laminated at some point which had preserved it past where photographs of its age and handling would normally survive. The lamination had yellowed at the edges, giving it the quality of something old and cared for, which is a different quality from something that is simply old. A man in uniform. Fort Ord, California. Taken in 1968 by a woman whose face was not in the frame, but whose presence was visible in the way the man was standing, in the particular attention he was paying to the camera, the way a person stands differently when the person behind the lens is someone they love. He was in his late 20s. He had the look of a person who still believed in the process, who had filed his complaint and was waiting for the outcome with the patience of someone who trusts that mechanisms function as described. Roy Merritt. Before the filing cabinet, before the building renovation, before the daughter. She held the photograph in both hands. Her father had built one piece of this without knowing he was building anything. He had filed a complaint in a spiral notebook because the thing he had witnessed was wrong, and he had been trained to believe that wrong things properly documented and submitted through appropriate channels would be addressed. The system had consumed his documentation in 6 months and moved on. What the system had not consumed was the daughter who grew up knowing without being told that the complaint had existed. that someone had tried, that trying and failing are not the same thing even when the immediate outcome looks identical, because what trying produces is not only the result of the try, but also the person the trying makes and the knowledge that trying passes forward and the next generation it reaches that understands what trying without the proper architecture costs and decides to build the architecture instead. 9 years. 4 previous operations, each smaller, each building something the next one could stand on. 17 complaints over 14 months. 47 minutes of recording. 3 weeks in this room in this uniform, wearing these eagles under a cover that Caulfield had never thought to question because it had never occurred to him that anyone would go to this trouble, that the institution he believed he owned might have been watching. She put the photograph back in the pocket close to her chest. She looked at herself in the reflection of the polished steel door at the bay's west end. The reflection was imperfect industrial, not designed for this purpose, but sufficient. A woman in uniform, a bruise on her face that was dark and documented and would fade in 10 days. Eagles on her collar that had been there all morning, waiting for the morning to become what it had become. She straightened her collar, not a performance. The thing you do when you are about to leave a room, when you have been somewhere and done what you came to do and are returning to the rest of the world. When the work of the morning is complete and the work of the afternoon is waiting, and you are the kind of person who knows the difference between the two and moves between them without ceremony. She picked up the clipboard from the shelf where she had set it when the generals arrived. The inspection form was still on the first page. She had been 14 items into the inventory when Caulfield walked in. She turned to the form, found her place, and continued from item 15. Some things require completion, regardless of what else has occurred around them. The ammunition count still needs to be accurate. The maintenance schedule still needs to be followed. The institution that had failed Roy Merritt in 1968 was the same institution that had produced Operation Iron Standard in 2024, not because institutions are good or bad in any simple sense, but because they are built from the people willing to stay inside them and do the work. Even on the mornings when the work is the kind that leaves marks. She worked down the list with the methodical attention of someone who understands that thoroughness is not separate from purpose. Item 15. Item 16. Each one checked, noted, verified, and moved past. The same precision she had brought to everything else that morning. The same handwriting she had used on every form she had completed in 3 weeks on this base, in this cover identity, in this uniform that was and was not hers. Outside Fort Caldwell was still a base. People moved through their morning routines managing the logistics and training and 10,000 small procedures that keep a complex organization functioning. Most of them did not yet know what had happened in Armory Bay 7. They would know by noon. By the following morning, people on installations across the country would know enough. Not the full complexity of what it had taken to produce one morning in one room, but enough to understand that the distance between a complaint filed and a consequence delivered could be shortened, that the mechanism properly constructed and properly supported could function as described, that Elaine Forsyth's complaint had not disappeared into a filing cabinet in a building scheduled for renovation, that someone had been listening, that someone had been for 9 years doing the slow and unglamorous and largely invisible work of building something that could not be misplaced. Colonel Sarah Merritt finished her inspection, noted the final results on the form in the same precise handwriting she had used for everything else, and closed the clipboard. She walked to the door and stepped through it. She left it open behind her. Some rooms, after what they have held, benefit from the air.